My son-in-law said, "Your father is cheap. He pretends to be poor so he doesn't have to give us anything, but a man like that always has money hidden somewhere." I heard him from the hallway. I had returned early because the pharmacy closed its consultation desk at 4, and the prescription I needed for my blood pressure could not be released without one final signature. The paper bag in my hand contained 2 cans of soup, a loaf of discounted bread, and the coffee Lydia liked when she visited. My daughter and her husband were sitting in my kitchen. They believed I was still across town. Lydia lowered her voice. "Evan, stop. I'm serious. Your father sold Whitlock Supply. Everyone knows what that company was worth. That was 8 years ago. Money doesn't evaporate in 8 years. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it becomes chemotherapy for a woman whose insurance stopped paying. Sometimes it becomes rent for a family sleeping in a delivery van. Sometimes it becomes a welding scholarship, bearing the name of a man who died without ever knowing someone remembered what he had done. Money can disappear very quickly when it is no longer being asked to remain yours. But Evan Kessler did not know that, neither did Lydia. That was partly my fault. I stayed in the hallway and listened. "He wears the same coat every winter," Lydia said. "He buys dented cans. He stopped using the upstairs heat." Exactly. That proves he doesn't have money. It proves he wants us to think he doesn't. Evan's chair scraped across the kitchen floor. "Your father negotiated contracts for 30 years. He built a distribution company from one truck. Men like him do not accidentally lose millions. There's a trust, an offshore account, property, under another company, something. My father is not hiding money offshore. You don't know that. I know him, do you?" The question silenced her. That hurt more than his accusation. Lydia was 39 years old, my only child, a hospital social worker who could sit beside a frightened stranger for an hour without once checking the clock. She had her mother's patience. She also had my old habit of believing that keeping peace was the same as protecting a family. Even continued. "We need $200,000. Not forever, just until the Riverton project closes." You said the same thing about the Grant Street properties. That was different. We're still paying those loans because your father refused to help. I stepped into the kitchen. Neither of them heard me at first. Evan was facing away. Lydia saw me over his shoulder. Her face changed. "Dad." Evan turned for 1 second. Embarrassment reached him. Then calculation replaced it. I placed the grocery bag on the counter. "The coffee was on sale," I said. Lydia stood. "How long have you been home?" "Long enough." Evan pushed back his chair. "Mr. Whitlock, that conversation wasn't meant. For me? No, that does not improve it." Lydia came toward me. "Dad, I'm sorry. I believed her." I did not yet know whether she was apologizing for the words or only for my hearing them. Even adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. He always dressed as if a photographer might appear. His property development company had not completed a profitable project in almost 2 years, but he still leased a black imported sedan and wore a watch worth more than my first delivery truck. "We are under pressure," he said. I spoke badly. "You accused me of lying to my daughter." I said there may be assets she doesn't know about. That is a more polite arrangement of the same accusation. Lydia touched my arm. "Dad, Evan's company has a project stalled. The lender changed the terms." "How much?" She looked at him. Even answered. 200,000 would stabilize everything. That was not my question. He hesitated. "We need 200,000 immediately. There are other obligations, but the project will cover them." "How much do you owe in total?" "That depends on how you calculate it. That usually means the number is larger than the person speaking wants to say." His jaw tightened. "About 900,000 across several entities." Lydia closed her eyes. It was clear she had not known the number. I looked at her. "Did you guarantee any of it, some?" "How much?" "Dad, how much, Lydia?" Her voice became quiet. 180,000. Evan stepped in. "The guarantee is unlikely to be called." You did not tell her about the full debt. She understands our finances. Her expression told me she did not. I pulled out a chair and sat. At 71, I had learned that anger spends energy faster than most people can afford. Tell me about the 200,000. Evan began describing a mixed-use renovation called Riverton House. Historic tax credits. Retail tenants. A lender who had become nervous after costs increased. The language was impressive. The cash flow was not. They needed money for interest, contractor claims, and a reserve deposit. No investor had committed to replacing it. Evan believed that once the exterior work resumed, confidence would return. He was not asking for a temporary loan. He was asking me to become the last person still willing to believe his projections. When he finished, I said, "I do not have $200,000. He gave a small, humorless smile. "Mr. Whitlock, I do not. You sold Whitlock Supply for more than $8 million. The reported transaction value was 8.4. Exactly. That was before taxes, transaction expenses, employee obligations, and debt. It was still millions. Yes. Where did it go?" Lydia looked at him. "Evan. No, we are finally asking the obvious question." He leaned forward. "You own this house. You receive a pension. You have no mortgage. You live like someone who earns $20,000 a year. Where did the money go?" I looked around the kitchen. The cabinets Marian and I had painted twice instead of replacing. The refrigerator held together by a handle ordered from an appliance repair website. The clock above the doorway had stopped at 11:17 3 months earlier, because I had not yet decided whether a replacement mechanism was worth $18. My life looked inexpensive because it was. "I spent it," I said. "On what?" "Things I chose." "That is not an answer. It is the only one you are entitled to." Evan stood. "If Lydia eventually inherits this house and whatever remains, then your financial decisions affect her. My death is not one of your business assets. No one said it was. You were discussing what I must be hiding while sitting at my table." Lydia said, "Dad, I don't want your money." Evan looked at her. "We are not talking about an inheritance. We are talking about preventing a business failure that will affect our home." She turned toward him. "You didn't tell me we owed $900,000. We are not going to lose the house. You just said my guarantee probably won't be called. Because it won't. That isn't the same as can't." Their argument had begun before I entered the room. My presence had only removed the part where they pretended it was about me. I opened my banking application and placed my phone on the table. The balance in my checking account was $9,412. My savings account held $26,000 and change, most of it reserved for property taxes, medical costs, and repairs. A small annuity paid me $1,870 a month. My Social Security covered groceries, utilities, and insurance if nothing unusual happened. Evan stared at the screen. "That proves nothing." "It proves what is there. You could have other banks." "I do not." "Brokerage accounts?" "No." "Trusts?" "None that benefit me." That answer caught his attention. "What does that mean?" "It means precisely what I said. You have trusts that do not benefit you." "Evan," Lydia warned. He ignored her. "Who benefits?" I locked the phone. "That is private." He laughed once. "There it is." "There is what?" "The money." I almost admired the speed with which he turned denial into confirmation. "You just admitted there are trusts. I said none benefit me. Then you moved the money somewhere else." 8 years ago. Under whose name? I did not answer, because answering would have required breaking promises I had made to people who never asked to become part of my family's argument. Evan mistook silence for defeat. He looked at Lydia. "I told you." "He put it somewhere." She stared at me. "Dad, did you give the money away?" There are moments when a truthful answer can still feel like a betrayal. I had not hidden what I did because I was ashamed. I hid it because public generosity often becomes a second form of ownership. People place your name on walls. They invite you to dinners. They describe suffering as an opportunity for your legacy. I did not want legacy. I wanted certain bills paid. Marian had understood. Before cancer took her, she made me promise that if I ever had more than I needed, I would not turn helping people into a monument to myself, so I answered Lydia carefully. I no longer have the money Evan believes I have. That isn't what she asked, he said. I looked at my daughter. I made arrangements after the company sale. What arrangements? Gifts. How much? Most of it. The room became quiet again. Lydia sat down slowly. You gave away millions. Yes. To whom? Not to one person, Evan shook his head. That is impossible. No. No one gives away everything and then shops from the damaged can shelf. I did not give away everything. I kept the house, an annuity, and enough savings to remain independent if I am careful. You expect us to believe you voluntarily made yourself poor. I expect nothing from you. He began pacing. There would be records. There are. Foundations with your name? No. Charitable trusts? Yes, then the money still exists for other people. That can be changed. No, trusts can be amended. Not by me. He stopped. You made them irrevocable. Yes. Lydia's eyes filled with something I could not yet identify. Confusion, grief, perhaps anger. Why didn't you tell me? Because I did not want you to feel responsible for agreeing with me. I'm your daughter. That is exactly why. Evan returned to the table. Under whose names? I thought of the answer. The Edith Bell Nursing Fund, named for the night nurse who sat with Marian during the worst week of treatment. The Samuel Ortiz Trade Scholarship, named for the mechanic who repaired my first delivery truck without charging me until the company survived its first winter. The Calvin Reed Housing Trust, named for a warehouse custodian who slept in his car for 6 months and still arrived before every supervisor. The Marian Vale Patient Relief Fund, using my wife's maiden name. None carried mine. Some beneficiaries believed wealthy families had established them. Some believed the donors were anonymous corporations. Only 3 attorneys, 2 foundation officers, and I knew where the original money came from. Evan saw my hesitation. You put it under other people's names. Yes, his expression changed, not understanding, suspicion. He believed he had finally found the hiding place. I had told him the money belonged to strangers. He heard only that the names were not mine. Lydia whispered, Dad, are you really living on less than $3,000 a month? Usually. And the company money is gone? Yes. Evan sat beside her. We need documentation. I looked at him. You need nothing. If those transfers reduced Lydia's future inheritance, there was no inheritance. There was my property. You cannot give away millions, hide it under other names, and expect your family not to question whether you were competent. The accusation arrived so naturally that I knew it had been waiting. Lydia turned toward him. Do not do that. I'm protecting you. By saying my father was incompetent, by finding out whether he was manipulated. No one had manipulated me. But Evan had just found a new version of the story. If I was secretly wealthy, he could demand help. If I had truly given the wealth away, he could challenge the gifts. Either way, he believed my decisions should remain available for his use. He stood and collected his coat. I'm going to find out where the money went. You are free to examine public records. I will examine more than that. Evan, Lydia said. He looked at me. A man does not build a company for 40 years and leave his only child with nothing. I did not leave her with nothing. What did you leave her? A father who is still alive. He did not appreciate the distinction. After they left, I went upstairs to the small room where Marian once kept her sewing machine. A green fireproof box sat in the closet. Inside were the final records from the company sale, taxes, eplut distributions, debt repayments, legal fees, and the charitable transfer schedule. The first page showed the net proceeds that had remained after every business obligation was satisfied, $6,340,000. The final page showed what I still controlled after 7 years. The house, the annuity, $35,000 in accessible savings. Even was right about one thing. Millions had disappeared. What he did not know was where they had gone, and whose names were written above the doors they had opened. Evan began with the house. 3 days after our conversation, I received an automated notice from the county property record system. Someone had downloaded the deed, tax history, assessed value, and a recorded lien attached to my address. There were no liens. The mortgage had been paid off 11 years earlier. By afternoon, Evan had also searched Whitlock Supply's sale records, the corporation that acquired it, and every limited liability company in the state containing my surname. He found nothing. That did not discourage him. Suspicion rarely weakens when it fails to find evidence. It simply expands the area in which it expects the evidence to be hidden. Lydia called me that evening. "Dad, did Evan contact you?" "No, he's been talking to an attorney." "What kind?" "Estate litigation." I set down the can opener. "Does he intend to litigate my estate before I have one?" "He says he only wants to understand whether the transfers can be reviewed." "Reviewed by whom?" "I don't know." She sounded tired. In the background, I heard a door close. "Do you agree with him?" I asked. The silence lasted long enough to answer first. "I don't think you were incompetent." "That was not my question." "No," she said. "I don't agree with what he's doing. But I don't understand why you never told me." I looked at the soup warming on the stove. There had been a time when Lydia called every Sunday. After she married Evan, the calls became shorter. Not because he forbade them. He did not need to. He filled their life with urgency, a project closing, a refinancing deadline, a dinner with potential investors. A problem that always required Lydia to delay something less profitable. Often, that less profitable thing was me. "I did not tell you because the gifts were not a family decision," I said. "You gave away almost everything you built. I kept what I believed I needed. What if you need long-term care? I have insurance and the annuity. What if that isn't enough? Then I will make different choices with what remains." Her voice tightened. "You would rather become dependent on me than keep money that could have protected you. I did not make myself your responsibility." "But you might." The concern was real. That made it harder to dismiss. "I planned carefully," I said. "I did not empty my accounts in one afternoon because a charity sent me a sad letter." "Then tell me the plan." I hesitated. Marian and I had agreed that anonymity mattered, but Marian had also trusted Lydia. She had never met the version of our daughter who now sat between a frightened husband and a father accused of hiding millions. "I will show you," I said. Alone. Lydia arrived Saturday morning. Evan drove her. He remained in the car until she came inside, then left without waving. She watched his taillights disappear. "He thinks you're going to convince me to keep secrets from him." "I am not asking you to keep a secret." "Then why can't he come?" "Because he has already decided the records belong to him." I led her upstairs. The sewing room had changed little since Marian died. The machine remained beneath its cloth cover. Spools of thread sat in a wooden rack. A dress pattern Marian never finished was still folded inside a paper envelope. I opened the Green Fireproof Box. Lydia sat beside me on the floor. The sale summary came first. $8,400,000 had been the headline value. After company debt, taxes, transaction costs, employee retention payments, and final obligations. The amount available to me was $6,340,000. I handed Lydia the first transfer schedule. $1,200,000 had established the Marian Vale Patient Relief Fund. She looked up. "Mom's maiden name." "Yes." "What does it pay for?" "Transportation, temporary housing, medication gaps, and household expenses for cancer patients." Why not use her full name? Because she asked me not to. During Marian's final year, we met families who could afford treatment, but not everything treatment disrupted. One man missed chemotherapy. because his car broke down. A mother slept in a hospital parking garage because she could not afford a hotel near her son's specialist. An elderly woman divided her medication because she was sending grocery money to the sister caring for her. Marian had said there were diseases in the body and diseases created by bills. She wanted the fund to address the second kind. Lydia turned to the next page. The Edith Bell Nursing Fund received $900,000. Who was Edith Bell? The night nurse who cared for your mother. I remember a nurse named Edith. She stayed 2 hours after her shift the night your mother became frightened to sleep. Why? Because Marian thought she might not wake up. Lydia pressed her lips together. I continued. Edith had never known about the fund. She retired before it was established. The money supported emergency grants for nurses and nursing assistants facing housing instability, medical debt, or family crises. Lydia worked in a hospital. She understood how often the people caring for patients returned home to unpaid bills of their own. The Samuel Ortiz Trade Scholarship came next. $750,000. Samuel had repaired the transmission of my first delivery truck during Whitlock Supply's first winter. I could not pay him for 6 weeks. He handed me the keys anyway. If the truck stops, he had said, you stop. Pay me when moving is easier. The scholarship paid tuition, tools, certification fees, and transportation costs for adults entering welding, industrial maintenance, diesel mechanics, and electrical work. The Calvin Reed Housing Trust received $1,100,000. Calvin had worked nights in my first warehouse for 6 months. He slept in his car without telling anyone because a medical emergency had emptied his savings and an eviction made new landlords reject him. After I learned, Whitlock Supply helped him secure an apartment. Years later, Calvin became a shift supervisor and trained half the managers who eventually ran the company without me. The trust funded short-term housing for working families facing eviction and provided deposits for people who had income but could not overcome the cost of moving. There were smaller transfers, a school meal program, a legal aid fund for widowed spouses, emergency grants for former Whitlock Supply employees, a scholarship for children aging out of foster care. Every trust was irrevocable. Every fund had independent administrators. I held no authority to withdraw money, redirect grants, borrow against assets, or dissolve them for my own benefit. Lydia read the documents carefully. You gave employees money when you sold the company too. Yes. How much? Nearly $800,000 was distributed through retention and transition payments before the charitable gifts. Why? They helped create the value I sold. She looked through the schedules again. You really kept only the house, the annuity, and the savings? Yes. What about the trust Evan thinks you control? I served as an advisory member during the first 2 years. I could recommend program priorities. I could not recover the money. Do you have any position now? No. Why did you resign? Because anonymity becomes difficult when the donor keeps attending meetings. She stared at the page bearing Marian's name. Did Mom know? She helped plan it. That was the moment her composure broke. Lydia lowered the papers and covered her mouth. She knew you were going to sell. She knew enough to make me promise. Why didn't she tell me? Because you were her daughter, not the executor of her values. That sounds cruel. It may be. I had not intended it that way. But secrecy has a cost even when the reason for it is generous. We had protected Lydia from feeling pressured to approve our choices. In doing so, we had denied her the chance to understand them. I thought there would be something, she said. For you, she looked ashamed. Not millions. I never planned my life around it. But you assumed. Yes. The answer was quiet. I assumed the company meant you would always be safe. And maybe that someday Chloe would be safe too. You are not wrong to have assumed I had planned for myself. But you chose strangers. No. Her eyes lifted. I chose promises to strangers. To people whose names were known to Marian and me. That still means less for your family. Yes, I would not soften it with dishonest arithmetic. Every dollar given away was a dollar Lydia would not inherit. Love did not change that. She looked toward the sewing machine. Were we not enough? The question reached deeper than Evan's accusations ever had. I moved closer. You were never competing with them. It feels like we lost. You did not lose money that belonged to you. I know, but that is not what you mean. She began crying, not loudly. Lydia had inherited Marian's habit of trying to make grief convenient for other people. I waited. Finally, she said, Evan is going to say you chose everyone else over us. What do you say? I don't know yet. That was honest. I closed the fireproof box. You do not have to defend me. He may challenge the transfers. He can try. Could he win? No. You sound certain. I planned for the possibility that someone would confuse disappointment with legal injury. The gifts had been executed while Marian was alive, and again after independent medical and financial review following her death. 2 physicians had documented my capacity. Separate counsel represented the trusts. The transfers had been completed over 18 months, not in a single emotional act. Tax filings, board minutes, and acknowledgement letters all existed. There was no hidden ownership, no retained benefit. No secret agreement allowing me to take the money back. I had not made the gifts difficult to challenge because I expected Lydia to attack them. I did it because large gifts attract people who imagine generosity must conceal manipulation. Lydia took copies of the summary pages, not the beneficiary records, not private grant information. Only documents showing the transfers, dates, legal structure, and my lack of control. At the front door, she stopped. Dad, if you had $200,000 today, would you give it to Evan? No. Because of what he said, because his project cannot survive without finding the next person to absorb its shortage. And if my guarantee is called, I will help you understand your options. That isn't the same as paying it. No. She nodded slowly. I need to talk to him. She left that evening. Evan called. You showed Lydia selected documents. I showed her the transfer records. Not the full trusts. You are not entitled to private beneficiary information. You kept an advisory role. For 2 years, that means you had influence. Influence is not ownership. It can become control. Not under these agreements. He changed his tone. Mr. Whitlock, I don't want to fight. Then stop searching for one. We need to confirm you weren't pressured. By whom? The attorneys, foundation officers. Whoever convinced you to impoverish yourself. No one convinced me. You expect me to accept that $6 million is gone because of a promise to your wife? Not because of a promise. Because of decisions we made together. Lydia should have been consulted. No, she was your only child. She was not a shareholder in my life. His breathing changed. You're willing to watch her lose her home while strangers live in houses you paid for. Did you tell her the guarantee could cost her home before she signed it? That is not relevant. It is the only part involving her home that was your decision. He ended the call. 2 days later, I received a letter from an attorney representing Evan and Lydia. It requested preservation of records concerning the charitable transfers and raised questions about undue influence, donative capacity, and possible assets retained through nominee entities. Lydia's name appeared beside Evan's. I read it 3 times. Then she called. Dad, I didn't authorize that letter. Your name is on it. Evan told the attorney he was acting for both of us. Did you sign anything? No. Then tell the attorney. I did. I'm sending a written correction. I sat at the kitchen table beneath the broken clock. What happens now? She asked. That depends on Evan. He thinks the names are proof. Proof of what? That you hid the money through other people. I looked toward the green box upstairs. He had searched for a fortune and found 4 unfamiliar names. He still believed names were masks. He did not yet understand that they were memorials. Then perhaps, I said, it is time he meets the people he believes are hiding my money. Evan wanted a formal accounting. I gave him one, not because he was entitled to it, because Lydia was. Her name had been used in a legal letter she had never authorized. Her home was tied to a guarantee she had not fully understood, and between those two facts stood a husband who still believed every closed door proved someone was hiding a key. My attorney, Margaret Sloan, arranged the meeting. Margaret had represented Marian and me when we established the charitable trusts. She was 64, spoke without decoration, and had no patience for people who called disappointment fraud. The meeting took place in a conference room at her office. Evan arrived with his attorney, Dennis Crow Lydia, sat between them but closer to the edge of the table than to her husband. I brought no attorney's case and no dramatic folder. Margaret had every document already. 3 foundation representatives attended by video. Evan looked at the screens. "Where are the trustees?" "You are looking at them," Margaret said. "I mean the people these trusts are named after. They are not trustees. Then what are they?" "Names." His attorney touched his arm. "Let her explain." Margaret began with the company's sale. She placed the closing statement on the screen. Whitlock Supply was sold for a stated transaction value of $8,400,000. That was not Mr. Whitlock's personal net receipt. She moved through the deductions, company liabilities, tax, legal and transaction costs, untrably retention, and transition payments. The final amount available to Marian and me had been $6,340,000. Dennis Crow asked. "And how much was transferred into charitable structures?" $5,680,000 over approximately 18 months. Evan glanced at me. "That leaves $660,000 at the time," Margaret said. "A portion purchased the annuity. A portion remained in savings. Some covered medical and household costs during Mrs. Whitlock's final illness." "And the house," Dennis asked, "was already owned free of debt and was not transferred." Evan leaned toward his attorney. "So he did keep substantial assets." "I kept enough to live independently," I said. "You kept more than you showed us." 8 years ago, yes. Money used for 8 years of living is not a hidden account. Margaret brought up the trust instruments. The Marian Vale Patient Relief Fund is irrevocable. Mr. Whitlock is not a trustee, beneficiary, or person with authority to amend, revoke, borrow from, pledge, or redirect the fund. She moved to the next document. The Edith Bell Nursing Fund has the same restrictions. Then the Samuel Ortiz Trades Scholarship. Then the Calvin Reed Housing Trust. For each one, the answer remained the same. I could not withdraw money. I could not replace trustees for my own advantage. I could not direct grants to myself or my family. I could not dissolve the structure. I could not borrow against it. The money had not been placed behind unfamiliar names so I could reach it quietly. The unfamiliar names were the point. Dennis examined the documents. Mr. Whitlock served on an advisory committee. For 2 years, Margaret said. He could recommend general program priorities. He had no authority over individual awards and no power to recover donated assets. Could he recommend grants to people he knew? The policies prohibited grants that created a material benefit for Mr. Whitlock or his immediate family. Evan looked at the representatives on the screens. What proof do we have that money was actually distributed? One of them, a woman named Priya Noland, answered, "We have audited financial statements, regulatory filings, annual reports, and independent grant records. I want the recipient lists." "No." His eyebrows lifted. "You expect us to believe millions were given away while refusing to say who received them." "We protect applicant confidentiality," Priya said. "Recipients include patients, nurses, working families, apprentices, and people in housing crises. Their financial and medical circumstances are not evidence for your private dispute. We don't need medical details. You are not receiving names." Evan turned toward Margaret. "This is exactly what I mean. Everyone keeps saying the money is gone, but no one will show us where it went." Margaret slid 4 annual reports across the table. These show where it went. They did not contain private identities. They contained totals. The Marian Vale Fund had assisted 417 households with transportation, lodging, medication, food, and utility expenses connected to cancer treatment. The Edith Bell Fund had issued emergency assistance to 263 nurses and nursing assistants. The Samuel Ortiz Scholarship had supported 118 apprentices and adult students. The Calvin Reed Trust had prevented or resolved housing displacement for 341 families. There were audit letters, bank confirmations, investment statements held in the names of the trusts, payments to hospitals, landlords, training programs, tool suppliers, pharmacies, and transportation providers. There was no account in my name, no shell company returning funds to me, no property I could reclaim, even read the totals. These could be grants on paper. Priya's expression did not change. They were payments. To people connected to Mr. Whitlock, to eligible applicants selected under program rules. Some of them may have worked for his company. The Employee Relief Program was designed partly for former Whitlock workers. That purpose was disclosed when the fund was created, so he benefited people loyal to him, I answered. I repaid people who helped create what I sold. You called them charities. They are. You used charitable structures to reward former employees. I used my money to help people whose work helped create it. Dennis Crow raised one hand. Evan, that is not evidence of retained ownership. Evan ignored him. Why put the funds under other people's names? Margaret looked toward me. The question belonged to me. Because the money was not a monument. He waited. I continued. Marian did not want a hospital wing with our surname above the door. I did not want people thanking me at dinners. The names belonged to people who taught us what the money should do. Conveniently, most of them are dead or unavailable. Edith Bell was alive. She simply had not known. Samuel Ortiz had died 5 years before the scholarship was created. Calvin Reed had died after a short illness, 2 years after retiring. Even heard death and absence as weaknesses in a scheme. I remembered them as reasons not to let their kindness disappear. Margaret opened another file. There is one additional document. It was a letter Marian had dictated 6 weeks before she died. Not a will. Not a legal instruction. A statement explaining why we had created the funds. Lydia recognized her mother's handwriting beneath the typed page. Margaret asked me whether I wanted it read. I nodded. She began. We have been fortunate beyond anything our younger selves expected. Walter built the company, but he did not build it alone. Nurses carried fear with us when our family could not. Mechanics trusted us before banks did. Warehouse workers protected the company when its owners were asleep. If the sale gives us more than we require, the excess should remember them. Lydia lowered her eyes. Margaret continued. Do not place our name on what follows. A gift should not become a method of keeping ourselves in the center of someone else's relief. The letter ended with a sentence Marian had added by hand. Let the help arrive without requiring gratitude. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Evan said, a letter from a dying woman is emotional, not financial evidence. Lydia turned toward him. That was my mother. I know. Then do not reduce her to a weakness in your argument. I'm trying to protect our future. From what? From this. He gestured toward the screens and documents. Your father gave away the security that should have protected his family. I watched Lydia. She no longer looked uncertain. She looked tired of translating Evan's fear into something kinder than it was. Our future was not $6 million we never owned, she said. It would have been part of your inheritance. Dad is alive. That doesn't change what he did. It changes what you're calling it. Dennis Crow closed his notes. Based on what I have reviewed, I see no factual basis to claim retained ownership, nominee control, or present beneficial interest. Evan stared at him. What about incapacity? The transfers were supported by contemporaneous capacity evaluations and independent counsel. Mrs. Whitlock participated in the initial planning. The documents were executed over time. Undue influence? By whom? The foundation officers. There is no evidence of it. You haven't investigated. I have reviewed the evidence you asked me to review. Evan's face reddened. Then what am I paying you for? Dennis met his anger without returning it. To give you legal advice, not to convert suspicion into ownership. That should have ended the meeting. It did not. Even opened his own folder. Inside were photographs. My house, my old car, the discounted grocery shelf at the neighborhood market. A picture of me leaving a free community tax clinic. He had hired someone to follow me. Lydia stared at the images. You had my father watched? I needed to know whether his lifestyle was real. For how long? 4 days. I looked at the photographs. There I was carrying groceries. Filling the car with the cheaper grade of fuel. Walking into the public library. Sitting alone at Marian's grave. Even pointed to one picture. He met with a man outside the community foundation. Margaret looked at it. That is Patrick Wynne, the foundation's compliance officer. So there are still private meetings. He delivered an annual donor report. Why privately? Because Mr. Whitlock requested that his connection to the funds remain confidential. Evan leaned back as if that proved everything. Lydia stood. No, he looked at her. We're leaving. The meeting isn't over. It is for me. We still need the money for Riverton. There it was. After the trusts, after Marian's letter, after the audits, after paying someone to photograph my groceries. The argument returned to the same place, $200,000. Lydia stared at him. This was never about protecting me. Of course it was. You used my name in a legal threat. You hid the full debt from me. Then you investigated my father because you wanted his money. I was trying to save our house. You placed our house at risk. That guarantee was necessary. So was telling me the truth. Even stood. We can discuss this at home. No, his expression changed. Not anger at first, fear. Lydia, I am not going home with you. The words surprised all of us. Including her, she turned toward me. Can I stay with you tonight? Yes. Evan looked from Lydia to me. You've been waiting for this. No, you wanted to turn her against me. I wanted you to believe me when I said the money was gone. He gathered his photographs. At the door, he stopped. If you cared about your daughter, you would help before the guarantee is called. I answered quietly. If you cared about my daughter, she would have known what she guaranteed before you asked her to sign. He left. The conference room felt larger without him. One of the foundation representatives asked whether the meeting should continue. Margaret said no. The legal question had been answered. The money was not hidden. It was not waiting for me. It was already doing the work Marian and I had chosen for it. But as Lydia sat beside me holding her mother's letter, I understood that another debt had finally come due. Not Evan's construction loan. The cost of every silence my family had mistaken for safety. Lydia stayed in Marian's sewing room that night. She was 39 years old, but when I placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed, I remembered the child who used to crawl beneath Marian's cutting table during thunderstorms. Neither of us slept much. At 2 in the morning, I heard her walking downstairs. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I joined her, Marian's letter open beside a cup of tea. I signed the guarantee, she said. I know. I read it. That is not the same as understanding the debt Evan kept behind it. She looked toward the dark window. I thought I was supporting my husband. You were. That sounds like you're defending him. No. It means trust is not stupidity. She folded the letter carefully. The lender can come after me for $180,000. Yes, can you help me? The question cost her something. Not because she wanted my money, because she was afraid I would hear Evan's voice inside it. What kind of help? I asked. I don't know. That is where we begin. The next morning, Margaret referred Lydia to an attorney who specialized in personal guarantees and marital financial disputes. I paid for the first consultation, not the debt. The distinction mattered. The guarantee contained limitations Evan had never explained. Lydia's exposure was serious, but the lender could not simply take everything she owned without process. Some assets were separately titled. Certain representations Evan had made to obtain the guarantee could also be reviewed. The attorney gave Lydia options: negotiate, challenge specific portions, separate her finances. Document what she had and had not been told. Prepare for the possibility that the lender would demand payment. None of those options was comfortable. All of them belonged to reality, even called throughout the week. At first he apologized, then he explained, then he blamed panic. By Thursday, he had returned to accusation. "You're letting your father destroy our marriage." Lydia put the call on speaker while sitting at my table. "I asked you how much we owed," she said. "You told me the project was covered. It would have been if Walter helped. You built the plan around money he never promised. He had the money. He gave it away 8 years ago. He chose strangers over you. No. You chose his money before you told me the truth." Evan became quiet. Then he asked to speak to me. I took the phone. "You proved your point," he said. "Now fix this." "What point?" "That you can say no. I did not create Riverton's debt. You could stop the lender from calling Lydia's guarantee. I do not have $200,000. You have a house worth more than that." There it was, the last visible asset. The one he had found in the county records. "You want me to mortgage my home. You have no mortgage now. A home equity loan would solve this." "For whom?" "For your daughter." "No. It would move your business debt onto my house. You would rather watch Lydia suffer. I am helping her protect herself from the obligation you concealed. That isn't enough. It is more than you gave her before she signed." He ended the call. 2 weeks later, Riverton House missed its reserve requirement. The lender suspended further advances. Contractors stopped working. One tenant withdrew from negotiations. Evan continued telling people the delay was administrative until a supplier filed a claim for unpaid invoices. Then the story became impossible to maintain. The lender did not seize everything overnight. It appointed a restructuring advisor and began negotiating with a new development partner. Evan lost operational control of Riverton. His ownership was diluted. The black imported sedan disappeared from his driveway. So did the watch. He sold both. Though the money barely touched the obligations, the lender issued a formal demand connected to Lydia's guarantee. Her attorney negotiated the amount down after showing that Evan had withheld material information and that several debts he described as project obligations belonged to separate entities. Lydia still had to pay. Not $180,000, $65,000 under a structured settlement. It was more money than she had ever lost at once. She used her personal savings and sold an investment account she had built through years of hospital work. I did not reimburse her. I sat beside her while she signed the settlement. I helped her create a budget. I gave her a room without rent while she decided what came next. But I did not turn her husband's deception into another debt that disappeared inside my name. A month after the conference room meeting, Evan came to my house. He looked smaller without the tailored coat and expensive watch. Not humbler, only less protected. Lydia was at work. I allowed him into the kitchen. He looked at the broken clock above the doorway. "You still haven't fixed that." "No, it costs $20. 18. He almost smiled. Then he saw that I was not joking. "You really live like this?" "Yes, why?" "Because this is what I can afford without asking the money to return." He sat down. "You kept the house?" "Yes, so you didn't give away everything." "I never said I did. You could sell it." "I could. You could move somewhere smaller and help Lydia." "I am helping Lydia. You know what I mean." "Yes." I looked around the kitchen Marian and I had shared for 42 years. I kept this house because it gives me somewhere to live without becoming dependent on my daughter. That is not worth watching her lose $65,000. You decided her guarantee was worth risking $180,000. I was trying to build something for us, without telling her what it might cost. He leaned forward. You think giving money away makes you morally superior? No. You sit here with your cheap groceries and broken clock, while everyone talks about the anonymous donor who saved them. No one talks about me. You know what I mean? I do. You believe generosity comes false if the giver receives satisfaction. Doesn't it? Perhaps part of it. That answer surprised him. I am not pure, Evan. I liked knowing the funds helped. I liked reading the reports. I liked believing Marian's choices continued after she died. Then you did it for yourself. Partly. He leaned back as though I had confessed. I continued, but enjoying what a gift accomplishes does not mean I still own it. He looked toward the hallway. Lydia may leave me. That decision belongs to her. You could tell her I was scared. She knows. You could tell her people make mistakes under pressure. She knows that too. You could tell her to come home. No. His face tightened. You never liked me. That is not true. You never respected me. That is closer. He stood. At least you admit it. I respected your ambition. I did not respect the way every risk became someone else's emergency. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped. Do you know what the worst part is? I waited. You really don't have it. The money? All those years, I thought you were testing us, making us prove we deserved access. I was not. You actually gave it away. Yes. He looked almost offended by the finality, not because the money had helped others, because it could no longer choose him. 3 months later, Lydia returned to work full-time. She rented a small apartment near the hospital. Instead of returning to Evan, they did not divorce immediately. They entered counseling. Lydia told him reconciliation would require full financial disclosure, separate legal advice before any future guarantee, and no contact with me about money. Even called those conditions humiliating. Lydia called them measurable. I did not tell her which decision to make. Keeping a daughter close by making her husband easier to hate would have been another form of control. One afternoon, Lydia asked me to meet her at the hospital cafeteria. She was sitting with a woman named Rachel and a boy of about 12. Rachel had agreed to meet me, though she did not know who I was. Her son was receiving treatment for lymphoma. They lived nearly 3 hours from the hospital. For 6 weeks, Rachel had slept in her car while her son was admitted, because she could not afford lodging and still pay rent at home. Then the hospital social work office helped her apply for assistance. The Marian Patient Relief Fund paid for a small apartment near the hospital, fuel, groceries, and part of a medication bill. Rachel held Lydia's hand. I don't know who Marian was, she said, but I need someone connected to that fund to know they gave my son his mother back. I could not answer immediately. Lydia knew why. She told Rachel only that Marian had been someone who understood how illness could empty more than a body. Rachel's son drew quietly on a paper placemat. A building, 3 windows, a yellow door. No plaque carried my name. No one thanked Walter Whitlock. The help had arrived without requiring gratitude. Exactly as Marian requested. When Rachel left, Lydia remained across from me. You could tell her, she said. No. She wanted to thank someone. She thanked the fund. That isn't the same. It is enough. Lydia looked toward the door through which Rachel and her son had disappeared. Evan thought the names were hiding places. They were. She frowned. Not for money, I said. For the people Marian and I did not want forgotten. She reached across the table. I was angry with you. I know. Part of me still is. I know that too. You should have told me something. Yes. The admission came easily now. Anonymity had protected the gifts. Silence had not protected my daughter. It had left an empty space, and Evan had filled it with suspicion. I thought keeping you out of the decision meant you would never feel responsible for it, I said. Instead, I felt excluded from Mom's life. I am sorry. She squeezed my hand. It was not complete forgiveness. It was more honest than that. 6 months after Riverton stopped construction, a new partner completed a reduced version of the project. Evan retained a small interest but no management authority. His company survived by selling 2 properties and abandoning the expansion that had created most of its debt. He and Lydia remained separated. Whether they would rebuild their marriage was still uncertain. My life remained inexpensive. I replaced the broken clock mechanism after finding one online for $12. I continued buying discounted bread when it was available. I kept the upstairs heat low, unless Lydia stayed overnight. None of that was a disguise. There was no vault, no offshore account, no final document revealing that I had secretly remained a millionaire. I was not testing my family. I was not pretending to be poor. I had simply decided that owning more than I needed was less important than allowing the excess to become useful while I was still alive. The company sale gave Marian and me $6,340,000 after every obligation was paid. Most of it became treatment, housing, tools, tuition, food, and time. What remained became my house, my annuity, and the small freedom of never having to ask Lydia to support me. Even believed a man like me always kept money hidden somewhere. He was right. I hid it in hospital rooms where frightened parents could sleep, in apartments where working families remained together, in toolboxes carried into first jobs, in the wages of nurses who could finally pay their own medical bills. It was hidden under other people's names because those names had once carried Marian and me when we had less. But it was never waiting for me to take it back, and it was never his. I had not made myself poor to punish my family. I had made the money useful before anyone could mistake my death for the moment it finally became theirs.